Welcome to the Darkstream, Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and welcome to all the reprehensibles, to the bears, and to the evil legion of evil. Tonight I'm going to talk about the unreliable trinity of science. Now, I hope this is working. The comments are a little bit delayed. Okay, you hear it. Good. Always good to know. So, good evening. Let me just finish my coffee here and I'll turn the camera back on. So, what do I mean by the unreliable trinity of science? Well, I have really bad news for those of you who freaking love science. For those of you who place your trust in science, for those who consider science to be a device useful for telling truth. It's not. It's not, and it is not in any of the three fundamental aspects of science. Now, I suspect a few of you know what I'm talking about. A few of you are familiar. And of course, it's from a book called The Irrational Atheist. Bolt suddenly noticed, wait a minute, you drink coffee at 1 a.m? Oh, I've always been able to drink coffee late at night and then go to bed. And we're going to address these points. John Stryker says, science is useful for identifying untruth. Well, you would like to think so. And people would also like to think that science is self-correcting. But what you're going to understand is that that's not the case at all. It's simply not true. Now, this is the book I'm referring to, The Irrational Atheist, and it's focused on atheism, okay? That's why it's called, the subtitle is Dissecting the Unholy Trinity of Dawkins, Harris, and Hitchens. But, I had regular run-ins back, around the 2006 to 2008 timeframe. And that actually, it was with an atheist called P.Z. Myers who desperately wanted to be in the Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris category. He ran a blog called Pharyngula that was quite popular back in the day. And my discussions with him led to a section of this book called The Case Against Science. Now, what does science have to do intrinsically with atheism? Thank you, Gummer Bear. Bear's throwing out a little honey. These bears are uncommonly generous as bears go. And so what's interesting is that science is the primary justification for atheism. Now, there's nothing wrong with being unable to believe in something. If you can't believe in something, you don't believe in it. It simply is what it is. But as Anaf Habib and others will note, Anaf says, science is fancy, abductive argumentation masquerading around as a reliable toolkit for acquiring knowledge, which it is not. Yet not only can science tell us nothing about epistemology, it is also highly unreliable. That's precisely true, and I'm going to explain why. Frank Underwood said, stop lying, Vox. We know you only drink expensive Italian wines. That is totally false. Totally false, and I angrily disagree with that. I also drink expensive Spanish wines. And occasionally, I have been known to indulge in a particular, very particular Swiss Merlot. Anyhow, the point about science is that, and I actually got this from P.Z. Myers. I always pay attention to the people that I oppose, just so you know. one of my principles is always understand your opponent's arguments better than they do. Take them seriously, learn them inside and out, and sometimes you'll actually find that they give you information that's incredibly useful. And in this particular case, the one thing in all of our discussions, all of his, meaningless rhetoric and misrepresentations and false narratives, the one thing that was really interesting to me was that he provided a significant and important concept that deepened my understanding of science, and I think it will deepen yours. And he pointed out that there is no one thing called science. Science is actually three different aspects. There are three elements that we use the same word for. We call three different things science. Now, there's actually more, there's also more meanings that you can apply to it. But when we talk about science, when people talk about how they love science, when people say science says, they're talking about one of three things. Number one is the method. The scientific method of hypothesis, experimentation, and falsification or confirmation. When people talk about the scientific method, that's what they're talking about. I coined a term for this just because I think it's useful to keep these things separate, but we'll get into that later. So first of all, you have the method. Then after the method, you also have the profession. This is what scientists mean when they say science is what scientists do. Now, I mock that in TIA, in that book, because, if I said, if a scientist defecates in the woods, is he doing science? No, he's not doing science. And so science cannot be what scientists do. What scientists do, as it relates to their job, I call scientistry. Because it's not necessarily the method. The method may or may not be what scientists do. And in fact, increasingly, scientists don't utilize the method at all. We saw this in the debate with JFG. We saw this in the various discussions with his defenders. We saw this in all the talking and discussions in the comments with the various people trying to defend evolutionary theory. What did they do? What did they say? Were they appealing to actual experiments? Were they appealing to actual use of the scientific method? Of course not. They were doing ineptly statistical analysis. They were doing philosophy. They were doing logic. They were doing, usually quite ineptly, mathematics. At no point in time was there any use of the scientific method at all. And yet they want to call it science. But it's not. And so first we have the method, right? And then we have the profession. And then we have the knowledge base. We have the collected and accumulated information that has been gathered by scientists and other people over the centuries. And this is also an aspect of science. And so we actually have, rather neatly, a trinity to which scientists regularly appeal. Now, we already know that the knowledge base is dynamic. At one point, we thought that margarine is good for you. Now we think margarine's bad for you. At one point we thought butter's bad for you. Now we think it's good for you. So the knowledge base is intrinsically dynamic, and therefore it cannot be any sort of truth-telling device. It's just knowledge. It's just information. It simply is. And that information may or may not be true. And everybody here, I'm sure, understands that scientistry is not something that we can rely upon. It's not something that we can believe in. It's that scientistry is only as good as the personal integrity of the scientist. And because scientistry is involved in this publish or perish concept, because it is so dependent upon government funding, because it's much more important that a scientist be a salesman or a popularizer rather than actually do science, then that means we all understand that it's unreliable. When people are saying, well, scientists say, 100 scientists agree that the globe is warming. 6 out of 9 scientists believe that this toothpaste is better than that toothpaste. All that's not science. That's democracy. That's polling. And so when you look at, and so this is where we get into, with scientistry, this is where we get into the concept of science being self-correcting. We get into the concept of peer review. But what you have to understand is that peer review and self-correction is a complete sham. At no point, what they do, another word for peer review is editing. They are simply doing what editors do. They read it and they see if it strikes them as being reasonable or outlandish. That's it. That's no different than what an editor does when he's publishing a nonfiction book. When I'm publishing Ship of Fools by Dr. Christopher Hallpike, and he's criticizing Yuval Harari, I read it and I check up a couple of the more outrageous, stronger claims that he makes, just to make sure that it's a reasonable perspective. Now, I am not definitively determining whether what Hallpike is saying is true, whether what Harari is saying is false. I am simply trying to make sure that he's making a reasonable case. And that's what peer review is. As for self-correction, that's what accountants do. They say, oh, science is self-correcting, to which I say, how? We actually had a debate on this some years ago on the blog, and it was humiliatingly bad for the pro-science side because they were totally unable to demonstrate a single way that scientific self-correction was either correcting or done by the self. There's no self-correcting aspect to it. One scientist does something, and theoretically, another scientist proves him wrong. It's not the same scientist. There's no self about it. They're saying, well, but science is doing it. No, it's not. The scientist is the one who is correcting the other scientist. The definition that is used to claim that science is self-correcting is no different than claiming that accounting is self-correcting. Because, after all, if one accountant gets it wrong and the other accountant uses accounting to correct his mistakes, well, then we say accounting is self-correcting. That's ridiculous. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, self-correcting about science. Science can't correct anything. Science is not a individual or a creature capable of action. Anaf Habib adds, science is self-correcting, objective, etc. are myths. E.O. Wilson wrote a book, Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge, in which he basically tries to normalize said myth. Consilience is a phony thing that is quite recent. Yeah, I actually read part of that. And, scientists understand, the smarter ones, and E.O. Wilson is one of the smarter ones, they understand how philosophically weak and how epistemologically weak the ground on which they stand is. They know that they are talking nonsense, and they're trying to find ways to shore up that faulty foundation. But it's built on sand. It's absolutely built on sand. And ironically, the scientific method, the actual application of the scientific method to science itself, when we apply the scientific method, which I have the very awkward term of scientody, when we apply scientody to scientistry and scientage, when we apply the method to either the profession or to the knowledge base or to the method itself, what we find is that science is so unreliable. It is so unreproducible that you are literally better off flipping a coin. The average published, peer-reviewed in a respectable journal study that is based in the hard sciences is on average less than 50% reproducible. You have better odds. If you want to know the validity of a scientific study, you might as well pick it up and flip a coin to determine whether it can be reproduced or not. Now, the idea is supposed to be according to science. If a study can't be reproduced, that therefore it's useless. And yet, none of these major studies, to the best of my knowledge, have been disavowed despite the fact that they are not reproducible. Carver Bear says, I thought Vox was a bit of a homo, but he's growing on me. Okay. I have no idea where that comes from, but c'est la vie. So the point that I want you to understand is that we have a word for when science is actually reliable. We have a word for when you can actually trust science. And do you know what that word is? It's not peer review. It's not published. It has nothing to do with Nobel Prizes or awards or reputations. What it has to do with is engineering. Once something gets to the level of engineering, then you know it's reliable. Anaf says, Loudon's pessimistic meta-induction notes that when the method gets applied, the only constant is change. There is no convergence to knowledge. I'm not sure what that I mean, you're getting a little deep there, Anaf. The point that I'm trying to make is that whenever you see someone saying, science says, they're using rhetoric. They're using wizardry. Whenever they try to argue that science says something, remember, that's like saying flipping this coin says something. And what people will often try to do, what people who are enthusiastic about science often try to do, is they attempt to retreat to claiming that technology comes from science. That's not true, and in fact, it's usually backwards. Science comes from societal wealth, it comes from technological change, and most of those technological changes precede the science that is later used to explain them. Science doesn't create new technologies for the most part. It can be used to do so, but in general, science is what scientists do to explain why the technology works. And so it's very important to understand this, because science is used as a rhetorical and philosophical weapon. Fernie has it right, also known as the dude on Joe Rogan who says the earth isn't flat because cell phones is science. That makes no difference. Yeah, and Dawkins does the same thing. Science works. Planes fly, cars drive, computers compute. If you base medicine on science, you cure people. If you base the design of planes on science, they fly. It works. But science was not used to develop planes. Science was not used to develop cars. It was used to develop some of the technology incorporated to design computers, but it wasn't used on all of it. And medicine very seldom relies on science. Do you realize that they simply flat out do not do proper scientific studies, double-blind experiments, etc.? They do not do them for any of the vaccinations that they give people. In fact, it's so bad that in Italy, recently, they went and tested all the vaccines and found out that none of them actually had the material in them that they supposedly had. So they fired the entire vaccine board. Modern science is largely a charade. Dune Bear says technocracy. Well, that's what they want us to fall for. They want us to accept these charlatans as experts. They want us to completely change our way of living because some scientists rely on fake studies, fake hypotheses. They pretend that they have knowledge that they don't have in order to get us to fall in line. And so that's why it's very important to reject the concept of science as a reasonable arbiter of truth. It's not. Jack Cool says, I've been saying what you're now saying about Darwinism since I was 19. Nobody will listen to me. They default to, but my science says, well, that's right. Because, back in back thousands of years ago, the people who do that would have also argued that, they needed to sacrifice a child to the sun god or to the rain god to make it rain. They would have just accepted it, and they would have said, well, the guy with the feathers in his headband says so. William Gibson says, can anyone prove we live on a spinning ball? There is no curvature. I'm totally uninterested in that sort of thing. That's really more of a Owen channel type of thing. I have zero interest whatsoever in all of the flat Earth, diamond-shaped Earth, tesseract-shaped Earth. To quote Sherlock Holmes, I don't care if the Earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the Earth. Anoff says, basically the method's application just gets one theory beating another theory and on and on and on. At no point can the scientist or the user of the method claim to know anything. It's a farce. It is. Science is about explanation. The main way that we figure out whether things work or not is we mess around with them and we see what works. Still today, that's how most drugs are developed. Still today, that's how an awful lot of technologies are developed. Technologies are developed because people go, what would happen if I did X? Or gee, I would sure like it if I could do Y. Science can be very, very useful for explaining to us why things happen to work the way they do. And sometimes that will give us ideas for how we can do something else new. But it's not the only way it happens. And in fact, scientists are not generally that involved in moving technology forward. They don't have the right mindset for it. They're not entrepreneurs. They don't create startups. When they do, they tend to fail at an even higher rate than normal startups do. Look at all the green companies that heavily funded green companies started by scientists for the most part, when they're not just started by political hacks. But even the political hacks were usually teamed up with scientists and using them as cover. And an amazing number of those companies are already out of business. They got millions and millions of dollars of funding from the Obama administration, and they're already done. They're already dead. So don't confuse science with a tool for actually telling the truth. It is a potentially useful tool, but it has its limits. And that's the important thing to understand, is that science is always going to be flawed because it depends upon humans. As long as scientists are human, they will be corruptible, they will be egotistical, they will be vain, and they will be prone to concealing their failures and exaggerating their successes. Anaf says, correct science is about explanation, but tell that to any scientist and they will grimace in pain and misery. They are very unwilling to abandon the myth of science tracks objective reality. Of course they are, because their status depends upon it. They have become, for the secular community, they have become a honored and well-compensated and high-status priesthood. Naturally, they don't want to give it up. Frank Underwood said, is it real science if it is reliably predictive? Well, if it's based on the method and it is reliably predictive, then yes, it might be, but it isn't necessarily. Hano says, a lot of the people who advanced science in fields like electricity were uneducated inventors. They experimented and found what worked all the time. Precisely. And that's still how things move forward. I have no idea what the best books on the American Civil War are. I've read a few, but I haven't read enough to say definitively that this one is better and this one's not. Of course, I've read A Canticle for Leibowitz. Great book. Highly recommended. Definitely influences my thinking to a certain extent. And keep in mind, when we're talking about this, we're not talking about the soft sciences. We're not talking about the social sciences, which from the point of view of Scientology, from the point of view of the scientific method, are obvious nonsense. And if you look statistically, and people have done this, when you do statistical analysis of various studies, they find a improbably high percentage of positive results. Because everybody used, everybody kind of fudges the figures a little bit. And because they all do that, it shows up in the statistics, and it shows just from that perspective alone how unreliable modern professional science is. Sean Green gets it wrong. Vox tried to use science to criticize evolution and failed. I didn't fail at all. I proposed a hypothesis. That's it. You haven't done the studies. You haven't done anything. You don't even understand science to realize that I did actually engage in an act of science. I proposed a hypothesis. But that's it. Nothing. You haven't defended evolution either. To say that anyone in that regard has been successful or failed is wildly premature. But see, you're resorting to rhetoric And that's why your attempt to resort to rhetoric demonstrates how desperate you are. You can't make a case, and so you're resorting to rhetoric to just try to discredit and disqualify, which is why I can just discredit and disqualify you by pointing out that you're a moron. You literally don't understand what science is. So we're going to get rid of this guy who keeps going off about some random person I don't care about. It's very strange, The reason that some people have complained that Owen has gone to a membership model and so forth, and I certainly will too once it gets once the membership is enough. That's why, because people who have skin in the game, as Taleb points out, are there for a reason. But when you leave things wide open, and I will always have wide open streams for the most part, but when you want to actually address a topic and stay on topic, you can't allow these people to come in, because they're constantly trying to steer you off track, get you off the record. Enough says, heck, even Scientology isn't safe. Popper's student Lakatos shows that falsification doesn't work. You can never use an objective standard to differentiate a critical falsificationary case from a non-critical anomalous case. Well, I think that's true on the philosophical level, but I think on the practical level, the falsification is useful. It certainly gets us to that Newtonian model of, okay, maybe it's not 100% accurate, but at least we can hit something with a rocket with it. We can use it to explain how the ball we throw goes the way it does. But again, it's not designed to be a truth device. It's not designed to do that. Vocalock says, trolls are annoying, but you certainly don't want a hug box. That's not even possible. You understand that most of the people don't understand everything I'm saying. And absolutely most of the people, even my fans, don't agree with everything that I'm saying. I've been blogging for 16 years. I don't know if you've ever visited the blog, but it is absolutely not a hug box. Some of the most detailed, longest, and vicious debates that we've had are between me and my oldest readers. Look up the inflation-deflation debate. That's a debate between me and VFM number 1. Okay? Literally the first to swear mindless obedience to me, and that's what we do. Okay? So anyone who is talking about hug boxes or echo chambers is just engaging in meaningless rhetoric. And frankly, they probably shouldn't stick around much, because either they're being dishonest or they're just ignorant. Anaf says, Lakatos would agree with you. That is basically his conclusion as well. For practical purposes, it's good enough to use falsification. Yeah, well, that makes sense. I'm just Tony. Tony says, oh, wow, you're such a humble man. It all depends on what you mean by humility. I'm not humble about my intelligence any more than Owen's humble about his height. It is what it is. I'm not humble. I wasn't humble about my speed as a Division I sprinter. When I would get on the soccer field back then when I was younger, I would just tell the defender, you can't cover me, so don't even try. And keep your hands off, because you're going to be grabbing my jersey a lot, and I don't want you to do that. So, but we can and we must be epistemologically humble. We must be humble about the limits of our knowledge and the limits of our capabilities. I'm very, very aware of the limits of my knowledge and the limits of my abilities. I try to remain squarely within the sweet spot of what I'm actually able to do reasonably well. Thomas Tefferson says, thanks for speaking truth to science. I studied chem in uni and dropped it halfway through because it's bull. I now study epistemology on my own terms. Well, I can't testify to chemistry being bull but I don't know what they were teaching in your program either. I mean, certainly, I don't think chemistry is complete BS. It's pretty solid. If you put X and Y together, Z happens. We don't need to run a million experiments of the same thing to conclude, you know what, we've done this 1,000 times. It's going to happen again 1,001st time. But that's how it is. Now, I have a bit of a treat for you. I hope this is going to work. You may have noticed I mentioned last night that we had released the audiobooks for the Promethean and for the Missionaries. I have to tell you, the Missionaries is one of the funniest books you will ever read. Even people who are offended by it thought it was hilarious. The Promethean, I am very, very proud that it exists at all because I actively lobbied the author, who is a scientist of more than a little note. I lobbied him intensively to write it because I knew that he is an unusually skilled author, Owen Stanley. And, he said, I think I've just got the one book in me. I started writing it, years ago, and I'm glad I was able to finish it finally, but, that's all I have. And I said, look, there's no way that you can write a book that good and be unable to write anything. I said, anything you write is probably going to be better than most of what is out there. And so he said, well, it's very kind of you, but I don't think so. And then he called me up about 3 months later. He said, I have an idea. What would happen if an American billionaire tried to build a Superman? Like, what obstacles would he run into trying to do so? He said, because I've just watched the academic system and the scientific community and everything become so poisoned and so hopeless and so completely out of control and so politically correct that I wonder what would happen. And I said, well, all I know is I bet that you can make it funny. He said, well, let me see what I can do. And anyhow, he wrote this book, and I'm going to play you about a 5-minute section of the audiobook here. And I think you will find it to be more than a little bit amusing. Let's see if this works. I'm going to first try turning the camera off for a second. There we go. Then I'm going to bring up the cover if I can. There we go. I'll see if we can go all the way black here. Yep. Okay, good. And now I'm going to try playing this, and then so let me know if you can hear the audio when I start it playing.
Chapter 6. Despite Harry's enormous wealth, he was dismayed when the estimates from Bill Grogan and Vishnu were finally presented to him, not to mention Wayne Ruger's, which looked like the defense budget for a small but unusually belligerent third world nation. The project was obviously going to need considerably more money than he had originally anticipated, and unfortunately, most of his capital was tied up in various forms of investment, that precluded easy liquidation. Like most billionaires of his class, he had less cash in his bank account than was carried by the average Uber driver. He was sitting in his office with Jerry one morning, reviewing the 3 estimates, which, no matter how many times he read them over, obstinately refused to shrink, and discussing the inevitable cash flow crisis they would entail. By now, Jerry had quite a good grasp of the British R&D scene, and he suggested that Harry approach the government's Bioengineering Research Fund to see if they would consider offering some support to Project Frank. "But if we do that," Harry objected, "Frank won't be a secret any longer. We can't risk that." Jerry told him not to worry. Granting agencies like the fund deal with this problem of commercial sensitivity all the time. They have a very strict confidentiality policy that no details of any applications or grants are put in the public domain. None of our possible competitors is going to find out what we're doing until it's far too late. Not seeing any other way to move forward on the project, Harry reluctantly agreed to Jerry's proposal. So they sent in an application containing the detailed specifications for Project Frank to the fund, and upon opening his morning mail a few weeks later, Harry was delighted to find a letter from Professor Price Williams, the fund's chairman, saying that they had been most impressed by the specifications and might, in due course, be able to offer a grant of up to £4 million. But before the application could proceed any further, the project would have to be approved by their former ethics committee, since many of the projects supported by the fund had applications in medicine and social welfare. Rather ominously, the professor mentioned that the ethics committee had recently been renamed the Diversity and Inclusion Committee by the Department of Culture, but the CVs of the committee members were enclosed in order to give Mr. Hockenheimer the opportunity to prepare himself for the kind of questions they might put to him, and Professor Price Williams wished him the best of luck. The appointment with the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Bioengineering Research Fund turned out to be on a Friday afternoon at the committee's offices in a magnificent house overlooking Regent's Park, one of the most desirable locations in London, and rented at vast expense by the Department of Culture. The government was lucky enough to be able to call upon a large pool of high-minded volunteers for such committees, who were happy to give impartial advice for the public good, without any recompense apart from their expenses. In this case, it is true, none of them happened to possess any scientific or engineering background whatever, let alone any qualifications to discuss robotics. Fortunately, practical knowledge of this kind was not considered necessary because the function of the committee was to bring a more morally enlightened and humane perspective to the discussions that was beyond the limited mental horizon of engineers. The chairperson was a tall, handsome woman, Nkwandi Obulajuwan, who had been appointed to head the committee when the department found that she was not only a second-generation Nigerian immigrant, but also wheelchair-bound, which was believed to give her special insight into the challenges of marginalization. Despite her triple handicaps of race, gender, and physical disability, she had nevertheless achieved a very comfortable life as a lawyer representing her fellow immigrants. To be sure, most of them happened to be very wealthy relatives of very corrupt African politicians and Middle East royal families, but she did not think this was grounds for discriminating against them by refusing to help them. The committee had read Harry's CV and the specifications for Project Frank prior to the meeting, and in the preliminary discussions its members had taken a distinctly hostile view of both Harry and his project. As a very white, very male, and very rich American capitalist who had literally built his fortune on the exploitation of women adorning themselves for the sexual pleasure of men, he was already politically suspect, and his project promised to be even worse. While the technical specifications were almost entirely above their heads, they had grasped the general gist of Harry's proposal, and as Nkwandi said when Harry took his seat at the end of the table, "Our main problem, Mr. Hockenheimer, is that your whole project has some dangerously elitist tendencies, and is markedly insensitive to just about every marginalized community in our society. We feel that it's hard to combine the idea of a toy for the corporate elite with the principles of equality, diversity, and inclusion that guide this committee. If your project is approved, it is bound to become extremely well known, and one may even say iconic. So we have to consider very carefully what kind of messages it will send to the general public. I wasn't really thinking about messages, replied Harry. My intention is merely to build and provide a great new technology to the public. That's all very well, Mr. Hockenheimer, but the fact is that in this case, the medium is the message. You simply can't avoid sending messages in a project of this sort, and that's why, I'm afraid, we're going to require some dramatic modifications before we can even consider approving it for funding. Perhaps I should explain that whereas the old Ethics Committee existed primarily to ensure there were no inappropriate conflicts of interest, the Diversity and Inclusion Committee has the much broader remit of ensuring that the fund's projects adhere to the societally correct values of equality and social justice.
All right, so that is a selection from The Promethean by Owen Stanley. And let's turn this back on. It was kind of funny watching how people were coming into the stream going, what the hell's going on with this? What is this? Anyhow, if you're interested in checking out the rest of the audiobook, we actually have the audiobook plus for sale. I think it's $12.99. It's about 5.5, 6 hours. And it also includes the ebook in both Kindle and EPUB format. It's fiction, but it is such realistic fiction that it sounds almost real. And it's absolutely hysterical because let's just say things go downhill from there. It's an absolutely brilliant satirical novel. It is much, much funnier than anything Kurt Vonnegut ever wrote. And it's, I actually edited out the description of the rest of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, but it was pretty crazy. This is also available in paperback and hardcover. Streep said he just picked up the book. The name of here, I'll write the book down. Just it's below the chat, but this is The Promethean by Owen Stanley. And the thing that's really incredible is that it's not the funnier of the two books. It's really, really funny. There's one scene in particular that you will laugh out loud. I don't know anyone who doesn't. And yet it's about 85% as good and as funny as The Missionaries. So, anyhow, but it is kind of like the problem that faces The Onion and the Babylon Bee, which is that reality is rapidly catching up to, and even in some cases surpassing, satire. So, the paperback is you can find them on the Castelia Direct Store, or you can find them on Amazon. We don't have a U.S. payment processor on the credit card, but you can always use PayPal. So that will work. The Missionaries is the other one. Yes. Now there's a few people who just are not crazy about female narrators, but she does a really good job on both of these books. We were delighted to. I really like her voice. I think her voice is fantastic, and I was really happy to be able to put her on such a strong book. When people ask me what is the best book that Castalia House has ever published, I always say The Missionaries. It's close with Awake in the Nightland, but there are some flaws in Awake in the Nightland, despite the fact that it's absolutely great. But it is so. The Missionaries has no weaknesses. The book is absolutely phenomenal. Bobby Ledge says, I think I'm lacking intelligence for this stream. Okay, so let me make sure I've nailed the super chats down here. So where are we? Okay. I'll make sure I didn't miss any of them here. There was a comment about having somebody's having some problems on the Apple and with the MP4 files on the audiobooks. Send me an email. We're not doing tech support on the streams, but send me an email, describe the problem, and we will get back to you on it. I said Throne of Bones audio not working, follow the instructions. Yeah. Anyhow, just send an email with some screenshots. We'll get it sorted out. Have you ever had a prideful argument about whom is most humble? No, I can't say that I have. Flipped Over Production says, I'm almost done with my PhD in fluid dynamics. The scientific community, even in STEM, is hopelessly converged. Almost nothing of value is produced. Well, that's what converge means. Convergence means the institution or the community or the organization has lost its ability to perform its primary function. The convergence of science means that the scientific community can no longer produce or do science. Carver Bear said, as a JBP fan, I'm enjoying the first few chapters of Jordanetics. Sorry about the homo comments, though I don't agree with the reasoning for repatriation. Ego te absolvo. I'll be interested to find out if you're still a JBP fan when you finish the book. That would be interesting to know. Well, I think that you'll understand the reasoning for repatriation a lot better once the rifts in the societies transform from making people uncomfortable to widespread mass violence. I would like to be wrong. I think there is virtually no chance that I am. Keep in mind, it's not just my opinion. It's the opinion of a lot of people who are in the military, that are interested in military history, professionally or otherwise. Frank Underwood asks, are the appendix for Jordanetics released on the Kindle version? They should be. I've re-downloaded it on mobile, Kindle, and the Cloud Reader, but no success. Shoot me an email. I'll send you the EPUB, and you can convert it to Mobi from there. Or actually, I can just send you the Mobi. So shoot me an email. I'll send you the latest Mobi. You can load that, and that should work. Just make sure there's no new ones, and we'll go back to the regular comments. Thanks for your Streamvox. You're welcome. Sean Green says, thanks for taking my comment. Check out Ayn Rand. You're kidding, right? Obviously, I've read The Fountainhead. Obviously, I've read her both her fiction and her nonfiction works. If you look on my blog, you can see that I actually rather brutally mock her literary style. I think she had interesting ideas. Objectivism is a failed philosophy. It doesn't hold together. But as a novelist, she's too didactic to be particularly entertaining. Because she has such powerful ideas, it's interesting. But it doesn't. She has a lot of flaws as a writer. again, if you look it up on my blog, you'll see what I've had to say about that. Found this found the Silicon Jesus CD today at a used record store. Awesome song, worth every one of the 200 pennies I paid for it. Looking forward to hearing more of Psychosonic. Well, there's not that much of it out there, but I think we did like at least like 20 songs, something like that. Also, if you look up Sunyata by Basic Pleasure Model, that's actually a song that Paul from Psychosonic and I wrote and recorded together originally. Let's see. Have you read Ecoscience by Holdren? No, I have not. Do you recommend reading Murray and Rothbard's books? Yes, with the understanding that it's not gospel truth, and it does have its flaws. I do recommend, for a deeper understanding of economics, I highly recommend his 2-volume History of Economic Thought, or whatever it's called. Vox has read more books than everyone. That's not true. It's not true, but I probably have read more books than nearly everyone you've ever met. I mean, I even read, at the gym. I read when I'm on the exercise bike. I read in between lifting weight sets. I mean, it's basically what I do a lot. Jack Cool says, in my sci-fi verse, I recently had the idea to give its Federalist faction a fleet-based capital to avoid concentrating power in one location. Thoughts? That's actually an interesting idea. I like it. Let's see. Hello from Foxborough, Massachusetts. Well, hello from Italy. I was actually born in Boston, so I'm fairly familiar with the area. Ayn Rand is proof a woman can write well. I disagree. I think Ayn Rand is proof that a woman can think well. She's not a particularly good writer. And if you want to read a woman who's a really good writer, I would recommend Tanith Lee. I think Tanith Lee is the most literarily gifted female writer I've ever read. Susan Cooper is a wonderfully entertaining writer. She's written one of the best young adult series I've ever read, The Dark is Rising. Do you count it as reading a book when you write one? No, I don't. Do comics count? No. Comics are not books. I mean, if you want to see what books I've read, I used to actually keep track of them. I should start doing that again. But I used to just keep track of them. I got away from it because I didn't want to state my opinion about books that we had published, or books by writers that we didn't publish, because people tend to get their feelings hurt. But now that I'm just refusing to rate them, perhaps that's not a bad idea. Do audiobooks count? Sort of. I mean, I don't count them as reading, but I think it's not unreasonable to do so. So, anyhow, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate the subscriptions. It was interesting to see that a lot of people liked the audiobook sample, but it appears about 100 people didn't. So that's good to know. Yeah, I think what we'll probably do is we'll focus on putting up nice long samples separately. Unless more people really like having them as a break in the stream. But thanks for tuning in. This is the Darkstream, and I am Vox Day. Remember, the trinity of science is unreliable, and we will see you next time. Have a good evening.